Okay, so now we've learned all of the methods. So on your last page here on our notes, we have all of our methods with the advantages and disadvantages. So for graphing, it always works to give you the approximate solution. So it's easiest with Desmos, and it always works. And you can quickly see the number of solutions. So when you look at the graph, instead of having to go through and figure out if there's one solution, two, or none, automatically you can see where it crosses. The disadvantage of this is you cannot always get an exact solution if you're doing it by hand. Luckily, we get to use Desmos for it, but if for some reason you don't get Desmos, this one is actually the most complicated to do by hand. But with the use of technology and also your graphing calculators, it becomes one of the easiest. Our next method that we learned, one of them that we learned was factoring. So this is always a good method to try first. It's straightforward if the equation is factorable, so you can know right away. Some disadvantages are it's complicated if it's not easily factorable. So if it comes out to be decimal or you can't notice it right away, it can be complicated. Not all quadratic equations are factorable. So this does not always work. Using square roots, quick. When the equation has no x term, has no b term at all. So you can always use the square root when there's no b term, no x term. Cannot easily use when there is an x term. That's the disadvantage. So it all comes down to that b term. So using square root comes down to your b term. Completing the square. This always works like we learned before. However, it sometimes involves difficult calculations and perfect square roots. So sometimes it can get a little messy as you notice, or the steps, it just kind of involves more steps than the other ones. But it always works. When done correctly, you will always get the correct answer when you follow the steps every single time, over and over and over again. And the last one that we learned was the quadratic formula. Once again, this one always works as well. You can always find the exact solutions. However, some disadvantages, other methods may be easier or less time consuming. And you might not make as many mistakes because as you notice, you got to make sure you have the correct negative sign, multiplying, make sure you have your negative signs correct, all of that. But when done correctly and when you follow the equation, it will always work to give you the correct answers. So now we're going to take a look at 4 of these and we're going to talk about the methods. So the directions say, first, determine the best method, factoring, square root, completing the square, quadratic formula for solving each quadratic function. Explain why it's the best solution. If you notice, it does not say graphing. Remember we taught you all of these other ones because sometimes you're going to get asked the question, what's the best method? And they're not going to include graphing. So we need to know all the other methods, which is why we taught them and why we went over all of them. So using these 4 right here, we need to determine which one's the best method and why, and then you need to go through and solve. So what I do over here, I'm going to make a little note. First, I would always check to see if I can use the square root. So first I would check to see if I can use the square root. And then if I can't use the square root, the second one I would use is factoring. If I can't factor, I'm going to use the quadratic function or formula. And if I can't use the quadratic formula or if it's too long, too complicated, anything like that, then I would do completing the square. Because it can be the most difficult, has the most steps, I would always do that one last. So I would check those 4 first in that order. So for the first one, y equals 12x squared minus 1,728. So I look here, square root, using square root, advantage, quick when the equation has no x term. Well, if I look here, there's no x term. So that means my method, I'm going to use square root. And the reason, there's no b term, no x term. And then now we need to solve it. So we solve it by taking the square root. But first we have to divide everything by 12. So I would go ahead and do that right now. Go ahead and pause the video and do it. Okay, so now I'm going to do 1,728 and divide it by 12. You get x squared minus, and you get 144. And so now we can move that to the other side. So we get x squared equals 144, and then we take the square root. So x equals, and square root of 144 is 12, so plus 12, positive 12, and also, don't forget you need the negative 12 as well. Okay, so now let's look at number 2. X squared plus 7x plus 6 equals 0. 1, square root. Well, I notice here I have my b term, my x term, so I can't use square root. So now we go into factoring. I notice my value is, my c value is 6, my a value is 1, so 1 times 6 is 6. So it needs to multiply 6 and add to 7. And I know right away 1 times 6 is 6, and 1 plus 6 is 7. So I know right here my method I'm going to use is factoring. If you didn't see that right away and you went down to quadratic formula, you can use the quadratic, but the factoring is the quickest method. So the reasoning, just like I said, 1 times 6 is 6. 1 plus 6 is 7. So it's quick to factor. When I solve it, 1x plus 1 times x plus 6 equals 0. And then we go ahead and set both equal to 0. And we solve, so minus 1, so x equals negative 1, minus 6, x equals negative 6. Okay, go ahead, take a look at number 3 and 4 right now. Go ahead and pause, go through the 4 and see what you can do, and see which ones you think they are, the method, the reasoning, and solving, and then we'll do them together. Okay, so number 3, y equals x squared minus x minus 1. So I look at the square roots first. There is an x term, so I'm not going to use the square roots. Factoring, what multiplies to negative 1, adds to negative 1. I can't really do that. I don't notice it right off the top. So I'm going to go on down to the next one because I can't quick to factor like number 2. So now I'm going to use the quadratic formula, which we know always, just like we saw up here, always works. So I'm going to do the quadratic formula. And my reasoning is, you can say that you went through you can't find an easy factor and you know the quadratic formula always works. You can say because A, B, and C are all 1 or negative 1. I'm going to say was not quick to factor. And A, B, and C are all 1 or negative 1. And so now over here, remember our equation, the opposite of B. B is negative 1, so opposite of B is 1. Plus or minus the square root. B squared minus 4 times A times C all over 2A. And so we go ahead and we simplify everything underneath the square root, which you end up with 5. And then I'm going to separate into the 2 equations. So 1 plus the square root of 5 over 2. And 1 minus the square root of 5 over 2. When you solve that, 1 plus the square root of 5 divided by 2 is 1.618. And when you subtract it, it's 0.618. Okay? And then my last problem, x squared plus 6x plus 9 equals 0. Once again, I have a b term, so I can't use the square root because it's quick to use when there's no x term, no b term. We go ahead and factor. I think about what multiplies to 9 and adds a 6. Well, I know what multiplies to 9 is 1 and 9. Add those together, I get 10. I know 3 times 3 is 9. Well, 3 plus 3 is 6. So I know factoring can work real quick. And also, this is a special case scenario that we learned in Unit 7. So my reasoning is I'm going to write special case scenario. And I know it's x plus 3 and x plus 3 equals 0. Or another way you can write that with the special case, x plus 3 squared equals 0. And so now I know it's the same. So I know x plus 3 equals 0. X plus 3 equals 0. Minus 3 on both sides. X equals negative 3. And I end up with the same one because it's a special case. So when you look at the graph, when it's graphing, it just touches the x-axis. It won't cross it all the way, and there's not two solutions. There's only one. And so if you just follow these ones every single time, you can figure out which one's the quick and best method.